The Department of English and Comparative Literature is honored with the visit of Professor Ronald Strickland, who is the Chair of Humanities in Michigan Tech University, United States. I think I should, before formally welcoming Professor Ronald Strickland, I should introduce him with a few words. Professor Ronald Strickland is known for his extremely brilliant lectures, and some of his lectures are actually available on the YouTube. And he is an expert in critical theory, postmodernism, culture studies. He was a Fulbright senior specialist in Moldova State University, Moldova. And he also was awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2005. He won the Outstanding University Teacher Award from the Illinois State University in 1996. So I'm sure you are going to enjoy his lecture. As we know, I extend my deep and warm welcome on behalf of the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the Center for Theory and Criticism. Warmly welcome, Professor Ronald Strickland. Let us all welcome him, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Panyan, for that very gracious introduction today. I always look forward to these kinds of events as learning opportunities, so I'm eager to learn what I can from you, even as I attempt to share some of my thoughts with you. Let me wish you all a Happy New Year to begin. This is a very auspicious beginning for 2018 for me. Well, I've got a PowerPoint here, and I got the title Postmodernism and Its Discontents suggested to me, and I found it quite congenial, so I began to think about that. But then Dr. Prasad emailed me and he said, well, could you say some more about cultural studies specifically? Because the students here have been engaged in a course on cultural studies, and I'm happy to do that. Cultural studies, from its very beginning, resisted institutionalization. There was some fear that much of the force and the power of cultural studies would evaporate if it became an institutionalized disciplinary departmental structure. And it would become rigidified and lose its power of critique and innovation. Nonetheless, it has congealed to some extent, and there is a kind of a canon of works that every one of us read, whether we're in South America or in North America or Europe or Asia, and yet there are interesting distinctions to be made. And so one of the things I want to do today is to sketch out a kind of a genealogy that leads us to possibilities for cultural studies in 2018. And to do that, I'm going to begin rather broadly and talk about aesthetics in modernity. Let me read a few pages about the ways that a society acculturates its citizens in a modern nation state. As Terry Eagleton points out in his book, The Ideology of Aesthetics, the linkage between aesthetics and politics appears in Britain in the wake of the glorious revolution of 1688, when the monarchy was fully divested of its power and subordinated to the British Parliament. It was an era of excitement, tinged with some anxiety, with ideas about the possibility of self-government inspiring both hope and fear. In the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, the natural state of humans was to pursue narrow self-interest in a constant war of all against all, in a reasoned calculation to gain some measure of security for each individual. Against this negative sense of freedom, the Earl of Shaftesbury, writing at the same time, proposes a Platonic ideal of moral beauty, of moral judgment or taste as a positive force that bonds subjects together in a modern society. As it's described by Shaftesbury, taste turns out to be more or less indistinguishable from aristocratic manners and style, though now extended to the newly empowered bourgeoisie. This will be a community, in Terry Eagleton's words, in which the members are at once stoutly individual and also linked to their fellows by enlightened social intercourse and a shared sense of cultural manners. Assured enough of its political and economic stability, this governing bloc is able to disseminate some of its power in the forms of a general culture and civility founded less on the potentially divisive realities of social rank and economic interest than on common styles of sensibility and a homogeneous reason. A key factor in the political success of this bloc was that the bourgeoisie was eager to adopt aristocratic sensibilities. This quasi-aristocratic structure of feeling, to use the words of Raymond Williams, required a public sphere of coffee houses and newspapers in which political differences could be aired and debated. Social political consensus could be formed with the aesthetic guidance of writers like Joseph Addison and Richard Steele in the Spectator papers. In 18th century Britain, Terry Eagleton argues, moral standards were seen as absolute in themselves, yet to some extent diffused into the textures of personal sensibility, culture, and aesthetics. Taste was a more powerful statement of one's social belonging than either morality or ideology. Shaftesbury's conception of beauty is not an unrealizable ideal. For Shaftesbury, the beautiful artifact is characterized by a grace and a symmetry, and the moral individual evinces the same grace and symmetry in social behavior. In Shaftesbury's vision of a republican political order, citizens will behave morally because to do so is aesthetically pleasing, rather than, as in Thomas Hobbes' view of the world, out of fear and rational self-interest. So the modern philosophical discourse of aesthetics, the modern understanding of our term culture, was from its beginnings about politics as well as about art. An underlying issue was the question of whether self-government founded upon principles of truth could be derived through rational processes. Alexander Baumgarten coined the term aesthetic, borrowed from a Greek original that referred to sensory perception, but Baumgarten used the term more specifically to refer to the spontaneous response to beauty, unmediated by rational judgment. In his doctoral dissertation of 1735 and in his later book, Aesthetica, Baumgarten distributed his arguments with examples from poetry, but his use of the term aesthetic had broader implications for problems of the constitution of the rational self and for republican self-government. Baumgarten sought to identify a process of cognition based on perception that could supplement the conceptual logic of the Cartesian tradition. For Baumgarten, the aesthetic perception is both spontaneous and critical. On the one hand, aesthetic appreciation seems self-evident. Since it is spontaneous and produced by the sensory perception rather than logical thought, aesthetics can function as a universe of solidarity among a community of like-minded perceivers. On the other hand, aesthetic response seems objective, since it is critical and grounded in shared judgments of artifacts that are presumed to be objectively self-sufficient. Aesthetic response can function as an ostensibly objective, if not precisely rational, basis for a hierarchy of values. In place of divine right, aesthetic discourse, or taste, offers a way to invoke something like a transcendental warrant for political authority in context where reason may fall short. It prefigures, in this way, the vague, undefined state of exception, so uncomfortable to contemporary constitutional states as theorized by 20th century political thinkers like Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben. Baumgarten's concept of aesthetics is picked up by Immanuel Kant. In his Critique of Judgment, Kant picks up Baumgarten's thread that describes sensual perception as a source of experiential knowledge that complements conceptual knowledge. The opposition here is between experiential knowledge, what we feel and what we sense, as opposed to conceptual knowledge, which is presumed to be pre-existing, rational, logical, and derived through clear, pure reason. Our perceptions will be imperfect, but the spontaneity of recognition and the extent to which our perceptions are shared with others gives them a degree of validity. From this understanding of the subject's imperfect recognition of the object, Kant proceeds to the problem of how to arrive at a governing consensus when citizens can't be depended upon to come to agreement on the basis of reason alone. aesthetics provides that discursive vehicle for him. Right-minded people will share a spontaneous recognition of the beautiful, particularly in experiencing natural phenomena, such as beautiful sunsets. These experiences will produce a pleasurable feeling that is not exactly the same thing as the direct sensual enjoyment of the experience, but instead is caused by a felt satisfaction in that our consciousnesses are in harmony with nature. It feels good to feel good, and to recognize that your friends also feel good having the same experience. This structural factor also contributes to the sense that the aesthetic feeling is shared with others and that the feeling is perhaps universal. At fleeting moments, we will become vaguely aware of the sublime, something beyond sensory experience that we will sense is there, but we can't identify it specifically. This, for Kant, is rational, objective truth. Effectively, it's an intimation of pure reason, a recognition of something that must be there even if we can't quite define it once and for all. In the end, for Kant, conceptual knowledge, the logical and the rational, confirms the truth beyond the aesthetic, and yet the truth can be approached through sensory perception, which is inevitably colored by emotion. Kant's attention to the political function of aesthetic perception established a framework for critical reevaluations of democratic governmentality that continues through the succeeding stages of modernity. But a number of recent theorists have returned to the thought of Kant's contemporary, Friedrich Schiller, for a more complex articulation of aesthetics and politics. As Gayatri Spivak and others have noticed, in his Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, Schiller misreads Kant's critique of judgment in a way that gives a wider scope of political importance to the aesthetic experience. For Schiller, human consciousness is characterized by conflicting drive. One of these is a sense drive, that is, the source of sensual experience and phenomenal perception. The sense drive is finite and physical, and the consciousness produced by it must be regulated by a form drive, which can be associated with absolute reason. That's Kant's sublime, really. Mediating between these competing drives of sense and form is the play drive, which is the field of aesthetics. For Kant, sensual perceptions and aesthetic judgment remain subordinate to rational thought and conceptual knowledge, but aesthetics can provide access imperfectly to the sublime, or absolute reason. By contrast, in the processes of the play drive, Schiller's sensual perception engages on an equal basis with absolute reason. This mediatory preeminence introduces an element of contingency into the categories of human subjectivity, what it means to be human, how one becomes a citizen, and that anticipates a key concern of postmodern theory. There's a genealogical connection between Schiller's robust field of aesthetics and the materialist accounts of human subjectivity that were to be developed by Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. In each of these thinkers, humans are constructions of material conditions and social processes, not Cartesian subjects discovering their own truths. Schiller also recognized in industrial modernity a tendency toward alienation and fragmentation of individual subjects and of communities that would be shared by the English Romantic poets and also would become a theme of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, and the Frankfurt School critical theorists, among many others. Thus, Schiller's aesthetics belongs to a zeitgeist that makes a turning point in the trajectory of modern individualism. If we notice the emergence of modern individualism in the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, along with the rise of democratic citizenship, industrial capitalism, and mass society, we can recognize the decline of the modern individual in postmodern performative and contingent subjectivity, along with post-national cosmopolitanism, refugee nomadism, and post-industrial consumerism. From this moment forward, it will be increasingly difficult to uphold the concepts of autonomous individualism and a universal humanity in modernity. This can be asserted even while we have to acknowledge the powerful forces brought to bear precisely to promote the idea of individual autonomy. And I'll mention two of them here. These were quite often spectacularly and specifically aesthetic forces. For example, the literary form of the Bildungsroman, the novel in which we see a young person facing some crises and struggles and slowly and gradually developing into maturity and finding a way to assert a place of agency in a modern democratic society. The Bildungsroman also privileges a form of writing that cultivates this feeling of interiority. As we read the Bildungsroman, we feel like we are the hero going through these struggles. This could be me finding my way. One irony is that these heroes are usually young white men, so that same position is preferred to women, to non-white people, and people from all different classes. We all can be bourgeois subjects in the Bildungsroman. So in modernity, the ideological contradiction between the tendency toward individualism and an opposing tendency toward normalization is reconciled symbolically in aesthetic response and functionally in the processes of Bildung, or the individual's acculturation. This reconciliation and modern society's confidence in the individual's capacity for self-knowledge and universal understanding has become increasingly difficult to sustain in late modernity after the advent of mass society. One other example of the political relevance of aesthetics is in the system of higher education. I don't know if any of you have ever had occasion to read Kant's Conflict of the Faculties. Kant posits two different forces within the faculty. One he calls the lower faculty, and the lower faculty for Kant consists of philosophy especially, but also the traditional liberal arts. The higher faculty would be the so-called vocational areas, the vocational subjects. And for Kant, this may sound counterintuitive and strange to you, but his primary example of the vocational higher faculty was theology. And we would add, of course, medicine and law and engineering and finance and those things. Even though he calls philosophy, and by extension I would say cultural studies and literary studies and all of our liberal arts concerns, lower faculties, for him, lower is better. The lower is more basic, more fundamental. And he argues that these lower faculties will from time to time have to correct the errors of vocational faculties, these vocational subjects, in which the faculty are taking for granted, taking as self-evident values and perceptions and understandings of reality and history and culture and society and politics that are in fact narrow and limited and easily critiqued. In our current context, if we can broaden philosophy to include literary and cultural theory and substitute the practice of critique for Kant's application of pure reason, this is a good description of our proper role in the humanities, or as cultural studies scholars and practitioners, and as cultural workers in relation to the technical and vocational programs in the neoliberal, technocentric 21st century academy around the world, as I see it, not just in the metropole. Well, I'll skip over a few thinkers and go directly to Nietzsche's response to Schiller. Schiller's conception of the play drive of the aesthetic field as a field of mediation between sensual perception and pure reason can serve as a framework for understanding the politics of beauty from the post-romantic era to postmodernity. No longer is aesthetic simply the gateway to the sublime, which is equated with reason. Now the aesthetic produces the truth. What we take to be true is produced contingently, constructed within the mediating forces of culture through its mediatory role between conceptual reason and perceptual sensation. Ironically, one way the political importance of the aesthetic manifests itself is by the aesthetic flight from politics, the celebration of art as a rejection of didacticism, moralism, and utilitarianism that echoes from the late Romantics through 19th century bohemianism and art for art's sake, and all the way through to the Frankfurt School and, for instance, Adorno's mistrust of popular forms of art, such as jazz. By the 1930s, with the emergence of mass society, along with photographs, phonographs, cinema, and broadcast media, it was clear, as Horkheimer and Adorno were to argue in their essay, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, that the Enlightenment dream of a citizenship of informed political agency was faltering. Walter Benjamin responded to this. He analyzed how art and culture and ideology are functioning in late capitalism without prejudice against popular culture, as Adorno had. Benjamin recognizes that fascism succeeds in large part by aestheticizing the political, remarking famously that fascism is the aestheticization of politics. Benjamin is especially prescient in his recognition of how the masses are enlisted vicariously into the scheme of glorification of the warrior leader. He writes, "All effort to render politics aesthetic culminates in one thing, war. War and war only can set a goal for mass movements on the largest scale while respecting the traditional property system." It goes without saying that the fascist apotheosis of war does not employ such arguments. Fiat ars pereat mundus, says fascism, and, as Marinetti argues, expects war to supply the artistic gratification of a sense perception that has been changed by technology. This is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. Mankind, which in Homer's time was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, now is one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the situation of politics in which fascism is rendered aesthetic. Communism responds by politicizing art. Now, I'm going to head toward a conclusion here by invoking a thinker who's relatively new to me, and that's Jacques Rancière, a French political philosopher who argues for a reversal of the fascistic aestheticization of politics. Rancière argues that the response must be to politicize aesthetics. And he doesn't mean simply to find a way to package some particular political program in an attractive way. He doesn't mean aestheticizing by ornamenting or advertising. He means interventions that create new models for a distribution of the sensible. These are his terms. Redistributions of the sensible in ways that extend equality to people previously excluded from the polity, whether that's the nation state or the global transnational order or any community. He's looking for ways to theorize interventions that will lead to democratization. He wants to define democracy as synonymous with equality. Then, all of the things that we might ordinarily call political, he simply wants to call the police. And by police, he means, of course, Althusser's repressive state apparatuses, the coercive structures of society. He means Althusser's ideological state apparatuses, the educational system, the media, the church or synagogue or temple. And the political he wants to reserve for those acts of intervention that extend equality. That's the moment of the political. Those are the political acts. So he wants to redefine political really as revolution. By revolution, I don't mean just violent overthrow of a particular government, but a redistribution of the sensible, a redistribution of sensibility. Now, this is exciting for me at this particular moment for more than one reason. Happily, it gives us a big role as cultural workers and professors in cultural studies and students in cultural studies and teachers of literature and social sciences, history and philosophy. Also, this is a moment of great need. This is a moment of resurgent fascism in lots of places, and not least in the United States. So our work is cut out for us, and it is quite clear that something must be done, and we're in just the place, just the position to begin to do it. For Rancière, this project of politicization, of politicizing the aesthetic, is specifically embodied in a pedagogical project. In a book entitled The Ignorant Schoolmaster, he argued for a method of teaching that would not be premised on a hierarchy of knowledge between teacher and student,
That notion that political emancipation could be achieved by having students assimilate received knowledge of accepted masters is a contradictory assumption. Rancière published this book in 1987. That's about the same time that I was reading seriously and writing about these kinds of topics. In 1991, I published an essay called Confrontational Pedagogy. And in that essay, I pointed out that the premise of the knowing teacher and the ignorant student was really problematic. Students come into the classroom with quite a bit of power and knowledge. It happens to be, most of the time, power and knowledge that I'm going to be disagreeing with. It's power and knowledge that they bring from their home communities, from their parents and their peers, from the media, and they're bringing that into the classroom. And of course, as the teacher, as the professor, I have the power of the institution behind me. I have 8 years of advanced study beyond a bachelor's degree, and I'm 67 years old, so I have some authority of seniority. But they've got their parents, their peers, other students, their high school teachers who told them that they have to study math and science so they can be engineers and make money, and authorities all the way from media to politics and everywhere telling them studying cultural studies is not important. It's a dead end. In fact, it's a net loss for you. So it would seem then that there are two forces at struggle in the classroom. My erudition and my skill and experience is a good match for 35 of them with all their parents and peers and high school teachers. But I have to tell myself that in order to not lose faith. So I'll conclude then. Following Rancière's inspiration and the traditional inauguration by Kant and Schiller, I want to conclude with some remarks about aesthetic education, our work of teaching cultural studies. The ongoing cultural wars in the United States and elsewhere demonstrate that aesthetic perception and aesthetic discourse, that is, the production and distribution of art and cultural values, is a political force. Currently in the United States, we're constantly reminded of Benjamin's observation that fascism is the aestheticization of politics. We're reminded of that by our president, who manipulates the media with a relentless barrage of false statements and appeals to a substantial minority of the population with the statements that espouse ethnocentrism, authoritarianism, militarism, his reluctance to criticize the acts and politics of neo-Nazis within our society. I think we have something to gain by adopting Rancière's insight that if fascism is the aestheticization of politics, our proper goal is the politicization of aesthetics.